I'm Chris Walker at the International Forum for Democratic Studies. Welcome to another edition of Democracy Ideas. I'm delighted to have with us today Anne Applebaum, who's going to talk with us about the challenges to democratic transition. Anne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Anne, it's now nearly 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's more than 2 decades since the implosion of the former Soviet Union. But since that time, we've seen a reemergence of contestation in the region, where there are forces of coercion looking to influence the countries that are in the space between the European Union and Russia against more consensus-based ideas for doing that. How do you see these developments?
It's actually interesting that you use the word contestation, because you wouldn't have used that word 20 years ago. The countries which have had the most successful economic and political transitions in the last 20 years are countries which knew absolutely they had a cohesive political class, they had a sort of alternative political elite, which knew absolutely where it wanted to go after 1989. And maybe they didn't know precisely, and maybe they didn't know which kind of privatization they were going to have, or which particular form of constitution they were going to choose. But these were countries that were all headed one way by national consensus, really. So you have Poland, you have Hungary, you have the Czechs and the Slovaks, you have the Baltic states. These are countries that never had any doubts about which way they wanted their transition to be. What happened, though, in other parts of Europe is countries that weren't so sure where they were going to want to go, or where there were other interests at stake. People had interests in oil and gas or natural resources, or there were people who, once the economies had partly transformed, in other words, some things were private, some things were state, found that state of affairs to be a good one. I mean, some people did very well out of these half-changed places because there were ways of making money, often having the right connections and so on. And then so you saw a group of countries that didn't have a clear direction after the collapse of the Soviet Union and didn't make definite decisions at that time. And those are the countries that remain, if you will, sort of have more recently have become the focus of this kind of geopolitical contest today. So Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova.
And you mentioned the idea of alternative elites being critical to successful democratic transitions. What determines how these elites form and the extent to which they can influence politics after there's an opening in these kinds of settings?
The point about the Czechs, and particularly about the Poles, actually, is that it wasn't just Havel, and it wasn't just a few people. Havel was, in a way, the theorist of this idea. But you had in Poland, and actually in Hungary as well, if you had gone there in the mid-1980s, you would have found an independent scouting movement. You would have found some small businesses. You would have found quite a lot of church groups. You would have found academic organizations. In other words, you would have found people who had already begun to organize themselves inside the totalitarian space. And why that happened in those countries is partly to do with the decay of communism there, the fact that the ideology didn't last very long and wasn't very successful. It was partly to do with older traditions. It was partly to do with luck. I mean, the Poles were lucky because John Paul II became Pope, and he was an inspiration for precisely this kind of activity. It was partly because they were closer to the West. They had Western ties and links. You did see a similar phenomenon in the Baltic states, and actually to some extent in Western Ukraine. The early nationalist movements of the late 80s and 90s were exactly that. They were people beginning to organize themselves and make changes. You did not have that so much in Eastern Ukraine, and you didn't have it elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. And so, in a way, some of what's happening in Ukraine now is sort of what happened in Poland in the 70s. It's the society's beginning to define what it wants. What do we want to be? What kind of rights do we want to have? What kind of relationship do we want to have to the state? How do we want to organize our own lives?
You indicated that it takes quite a bit of time for societies to organize themselves in a way to achieve positive democratic reform. Do you have the sense that Ukraine may be working in this direction, in the sense that the society is now becoming more mature and heading in the direction of greater reforms?
Would that it were a kind of stepladder to perfect progress. I mean, maybe that's what will happen. But yes, I mean, I think before you have a political elite that can say, right, we want to be European, we want to have transparent laws, we want to have an independent judicial system, we want to have banks that are real banks and aren't just funneling money to oligarchs. yes, you need a society that knows that it wants that and knows that that's the kind of society it wants to live in.
And in broad terms, what do you see as the most critical factors for successful reforms in these sorts of environments?
If you look at the sources of success, look, for example, at the North African country that's been the most successful, is look at Tunisia. And what you had here, once again, was a political class that was willing to make compromises, was willing to jointly write a constitution with other people whom it disliked, was willing to think about the rights of the individual, was willing to lay the groundwork for a long-term society. You didn't have that in Egypt. You don't have that yet in Libya. You haven't had a kind of national consensus that this is what we want. And so at some level you need this national consensus, at some level you need people to feel themselves to be citizens and to feel some connection to the state and to want to take responsibility for the state. And you need in turn a state apparatus and that feels that it works for the society. And what you've had so often in post-Soviet societies is the state or the state bureaucracy and the government who simply don't feel any responsibility to the people. You become head of the country. What you do is steal as much as possible. Get your children to be the head of as many companies as possible, and then hope you can get away with it. What you need is a responsible political elite that doesn't think in those terms.
Many observers of developments in North Africa have used the positive Central European experience as a frame of reference in thinking about developments in Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia. How do you see this, and do you think that this may lead to overly high expectations in the most recent cases?
If you looked at Central Europe, even the very successful Central Europe, if you looked there in 1995, 3, 4, or 5 years after the change, would it have looked so marvelous? Probably not. One of my fears about North Africa is there were these enormous expectations unleashed by what were just street revolutions. They weren't major changes of power. They may be beginning to be, particularly in Tunisia. But the amount of time that's elapsed is tiny. These are, I think at the time I wrote, don't think 1989, think 1848. It takes, maybe this is the first generation of liberal revolution. There may be setbacks, there may be changes. It may be, these are societies that are just beginning to form themselves, where in Egypt you have very high rates of illiteracy, something like 60%. In a very illiterate society, it takes longer to explain to people, and it takes longer to make people feel themselves to be part of a polity or part of a state, which is an absolute necessary, important ingredient for political stability in the future. So I think we may have over high expectations of these kinds of changes. On the other hand, it's also important to remember that if you, in a very authoritarian or totalitarian society, change is good. It's good when people organize themselves against a dictatorial regime. It means that people are beginning to think, and it means that a better future is at least possible.
Anne Applebaum, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.